Hello dear chess lovers. Today we are talking about strategic pawn breaks. Many people also get confused when it comes to pawn play, so I keep receiving messages from people around the world to make more videos about pawn play. They ask me, how do we know when to engage with a pawn break? How do I even know which pawn break is good for me? And that's one of the overarching goals of this video as well. It's white to play in this position. Please, while I set the context, try to find a good plan for white. Maybe make a pawn move to improve your position from here, please. Okay? As you know, I'm now working on a course on strategic primer, very basic strategic primer course to give you the foundations of chess strategy. And it's based on two basic pillars: feeling for the pieces and weakness awareness. I will show you exactly what I mean in this video as well. As you know, teaching is great for learning, so one of the bigger goals, a selfish goal, let's say, of this video is that I also want to become a better author and maybe a better structure when it comes to the course on strategic primer. White to play, the clue is this, obviously. The bishop on c1 is lacking mobility, and that's number one when it comes to your pawn play. When it comes to feeling for the pieces, you must ask yourself a very basic question of whether the bishop is a happy piece or not. Are all my pieces happy or are they sad? And one of the first criterion to understand the happiness of a piece is to simply look at its mobility, right? About freedom. How many squares can it go to? Does it have a freedom of movement? Can it even move to many squares? Here we understand that the bishop has very little movement whatsoever. It's also hemmed in by the pawn on e3. The bishop is sad solely because of lack of freedom for movement. Let's say mobility for that, okay? So what's a pawn break that can liberate the bishop and give it more scope? And you're a great player, found the move e4, very standard in those positions. The bishop becomes a happier creature simply because the e3 pawn is now gone. Let's say after takes, we reach a very standard middle game position where the bishop is shining. It supports ideas like knight g5 even. Sometimes you can go to g5 itself. And this position is slightly better for white. Not a big deal. With best play, black might be able to defend, of course. But e4 from this position obviously was a very good pawn break for white. It also comes with an additional idea like e5, of course. You also hit in the center of the board. It's a multi-purpose pawn move. But one of the main functions is to surely make the bishop a happier piece. Let's continue from this position. It's white to play. Please tell me a good move, maybe the only move for white in this position. White is down a pawn right now. They have to be very careful to defend this position, let's say. And there's one move that keeps white in the game. Please, while I set the context and maybe give you some prompts, first stop the video and think for yourself, please. Folks, the prompt is this. The knight is dominated by the pawn on g6. Can you see it? The knight also doesn't have much mobility from g3, has no forward squares whatsoever from this position. It will be a lovely thing to activate our knight and maybe place it on a forward square, maybe close to the center, that it becomes a stable piece, okay? Right now this pawn is burying your knight, let's say, using my terminology, right? I have to change the picture. Please find a move that changes the dynamics between the knight and the pawn on g6. And there's only one pawn break, strategic pawn break, in the position h5 that gives you that, right? Because by attacking the pawn on g6, you're forcefully activating your knight on g3. In fact, you're undermining this f5 square for your knight. And what's the signal? What's the pattern? The pattern is the pawn itself is lacking support by any other black pawn. This pawn itself is, let's say, a loose pawn on g6, cannot be guarded by any other black pawn. So by simply challenging that pawn on g6, you're forcefully undermining that particular square for your knight, right? If, let's say, this pawn will be on f7, or let's say there was a pawn on h7 for black, then they would wait for you to take on g6 and they will recapture with the pawn, still burying your knight. But here, this pattern, this very constellation, very typical, allows this awakening operation or undermining square operation. And that's the only way for white to fight in this position. It also obviously, let's say, weakens the black king slightly, and white gets instant counterplay on the king side. Okay, now if black doesn't do anything, you can always take on g6, followed by knight f5 check or knight h5 check. Can you see how your knight has become a happier piece because of the disappearance of the pawn on g6? That's it. And if they play g5 here, then even queen f5 check is devastating for black because this doesn't work because of queen c8, followed by knight f5 check. The king is quite weak on the king side, and white's attack is crushing through the king side already. So once again, the first example, we played with the pawn move, we made a pawn break to activate our bishop. Here, we make a pawn break, which means those pawns are contacting each other like that. There's a opening up potential in the position. They can be capture potential in the position, and this is done to mainly activate a bad piece. The knight was lacking mobility, no longer after h5. Now comes this position. Black to play folks. Black is an extra exchange. Please find the best move for black in this position to give them a, let's say, winning advantage, okay? So, it's a move sequence. Let's say 3-ply calculation from here. Let's see whether we can find it. Read the board, please. There are many pieces on the board, but that's a big clue. You have an extra exchange, which means you have a rook for a knight in this position, okay? So, to make use of your advantage even more pronounced, you need to find a way to activate your rooks, right? One of your rooks should play a significant role in this game for your exchange advantage to make sense. So how do you, let's say, awaken one of these guys in this position, folks? You're a great player if you found the pawn break b5. Again, by making contact with the pawn on a4, hence the pawn break, you're activating your rook. That's the main function of this winning pawn break b5. After they take, huge question. Do you take back with the pawn or with the rook in its position? There's only one correct answer, and obviously it became obvious. Our idea was to activate our rook. Rook takes is the only good move. Now we will double up on the b file, and you will hit the weak pawn on b2. By playing like this, you also made this pawn a significant target for your pieces, right? They are slowly coming there. Weakness awareness. The second point of this move, you might say, is it made the b2 pawn much more exploitable on a semi-open file, right? It both made our rook a happy piece in terms of more mobility and room for movement, but also it made it even a happier piece because the rook is now attacking the weak pawn on b2. We are coming there very, very soon, guys. Weakness awareness, okay? If you take back with this guy, can you see the problem? You made that knight an amazing piece on the d5 outpost. That's truly a terrible move because this pawn was guarding the d5 square. If you take with the c pawn, this knight is now becoming an eternal piece on the d5 outpost. Yes, you gave white an outpost on d5. You gave yourself a weak square on d5. We call such squares weak squares in chess because no black pawn can control that square, and that square can be effectively used by the opponent's pieces. Okay, as in this case, knight on d5, you have no light square bishop, you have no more pawn to challenge that knight, and white definitely has some compensation despite they are being down in exchange in this position. So here, that's what I meant by 3-ply sequence. You first play b5, after a takes b5, rook takes b5, and you can stop your calculations here. You don't need to calculate 10 moves deeper from here. You reached your goal. This is called mini plans, effective mini plans in chess. Can you effectively engage in such mini plans? That's what masters do. Masters very rarely engage in 10 move calculations. Most of their vision is based on those patterns, right? They know, they can speak to their pieces. They can feel the misery of their pieces, and then pawn play always follows that, right? Pawn play sort of follows the thought of speaking to your pieces, that skill of asking your pieces how they feel in any given position. Also after b5, if white doesn't take on b5, folks, let's say they play b3, obviously you can take on a4 and you liberate your rook. Now the rook can go to b3 to put pressure here, maybe on a3 to put pressure on the weak pawn. There are two weak pawns in white's camp. None of these pawns can be guarded by any other white pawn, thus the name the weak pawn. And now black's rooks are enjoying the open file, and they also find those targets to attack. That's maximum happiness. We really should point this rook like a green color to really highlight how happy the piece has become. Well, after a couple of moves, right? You play b5, it became happier, and now it sort of reached the climax of happiness, right? Just shining with joy in its position, and that's how you make a piece happy in chess. It's not rocket science. It's about two basic skills, as I said. Mobility, the rook has no mobility whatsoever, and also weakness awareness. Can you spot those targets? Can you find those targets to attack by your pieces? Simply by attacking a target, a piece can become happy in chess. Continuing with the rook's happiness and pawn breaks helping rooks. Bronstein versus Korchnoi, a beautiful game. White to play, folks. Please, can you find the mini plan that was found by David Bronstein in its position? Well, white has sacrificed some material to come to this position, but black has several terrible pieces on the queen side. They're not playing any role in this game. While white has better central control, they expand in the center of the board already. The black king is not feeling so safe, but how should white continue their initiative in this position before giving black all the time in the world to maybe make moves like this, okay? So white has the momentum, but white needs to strike when the iron is hot. Can you please find that beautiful sequence that was found by Bronstein? Assuming you spend some time in this position, folks, here's the prompt. How do you make your rooks happier in this position in organizing an attack on the king side? And the answer is tactics, serving, strategy. He plays move 5. It looks unplayable at first sight, right? What if black just takes that pawn? And now you tell me after he takes f5, how do you recapture that guy? Right. Rook takes f5 anyway, and the rooks are becoming happier on the f file. Can't they simply take my rook? What are you talking about? And this becomes a little tactical training for you, right? Little tactical vision. The rook is not capturable because knight takes forks the queen and the king, and white wins. So white uses tactics, namely the rook cannot be captured because of the fork, to activate their rooks. You're engaging in strategic pawn break using basic tactics like that, and you reach your strategic goal of awakening your rooks on the f file. It's as simple as that. Now the rook can go to f6 even, you will double up, and this is going to be a very difficult task. Already, by the way, white is completely winning in this position because of their piece activity in this case, right? Every single piece will be playing on the king side, and look at the black pieces, just terribly restrained. Just to show the effectiveness of the structure for white, I will just give you one sample line. Bishop c8 makes sense because they want to park their bishop on e6, but look at your rook. An amazing piece on f6. I'll just show you very basic moves. Rook f8, queen g5. Already highlighting check followed by take ideas. The queen joins the party on the king side. Let's say queen d8, bishop e4. Can you see what's cooking on the king side, guys? Can you see the sacrifice that's coming? White attacks the g6 pawn with 4 pieces. Incredible, right? That's what we mean by local superiority when it comes to attack. White has so many pieces on the king side, so many men on the king side, and obviously, once that's the case, you can even brute force sacrifice a couple of pieces to make the opponent's king naked on the king side and find a checkmate blow. That's one of those cases. Black pieces are still sleeping on the queen side. Let's say knight d7 to attack the rook. Now you can even go on and take on g6, and white is completely crushing in this position, guys. For example, if they take with this pawn, then comes rook g6 check. You can even sacrifice the rook, by the way. You don't need so many pieces for the checkmate, guys. In chess, sometimes even those 2 pieces are enough to give mate. So you sacrifice 2 pieces to find checkmate. If they take on f6 here, nothing really changes. You can even use discovery to first do this check with the queen, follow it up with queen f6 checkmate. That's a cute little checkmate as well. So after knight d7, knight g6, the only try is f takes g6. Well, you can still go for rook g6 check. If they take on g6, they get mated like that. That doesn't work. So after rook g6, folks, king h8, you can even enter this line. Queen d8, rook d8, rook e6, and white is still completely crushing in his position. Well, it's actually extra pawn for white suddenly, and you also have this beautiful connected pass pawn on e5, better piece activity. White is completely crushing in this position as well. But the bigger point is, can you see that your rook wants to get active on the f-file, and can you engage in little tactics to justify those strategic moves in chess? Another instructive endgame for you. White to play. Please take your time. Try to orient yourself to this position first. who is better and why, and then please find a good plan for white. How would you improve with white pieces in this position? Folks, it's an amazingly beautiful position for the white pieces, obviously. Please compare your knight on e4 with the bishop on h8. Amazing knight on the outpost on e4. No black pawn can chase that knight in this pawn structure. Beautiful piece. Compare and contrast this with a tall pawn on h8, hemmed in by its own pawn on e5. The bishop is just a tall pawn. Plus, the rook is better than the black rook, right? The rook on d3 is a better piece. Why? Because that occupies the only open file, and the rook is doing nothing on c8. But there is no yet, let's say, so many entry points on the open file for our rook. Yes, it can go to d6, but there is no, let's say, next move after rook d6. So the plan involves you giving yourself better avenues. In this case, there's one more function to this move. Let's see whether you can discover it without my prompt. Folks, imagine you spend some time in this position. You're a great player if you found the pawn break a5. There is contact between those pawns now. What's the point? 2 points. If you take on a5, my rook is sliding to a3. I'll be picking up your pawn on a5, and I will be creating 2 new targets for my pieces. Can you see the point? One function of this pawn break is to create those 2 weaknesses in the black's position. The pawn on c5 becomes weak, obviously, right? Because the pawn on b6 disappears. Now this pawn becomes an isolated pawn on c5. It's a clear target for the rest of the game. But also, after you will take on a5, this pawn will become a new target for the white pieces, not to mention rook a6 ideas, rook b5, rook b7 ideas. The rook also will gain more mobility and scope and options from a5. So this pawn break, again, break it down to its core, has 2 main functions: to give more mobility to your rook, but also to create more weak pawns in the black's position. Okay? We can also call this the creation of a second weakness in the endgame. White already has a great advantage, but that itself is not enough to win this position. So a5 becomes the final stroke, let's say, that broke the camel's neck. And the second weakness is given to black forcefully. First of all, after a5, what if black waits and doesn't take on a5? Let's say rook c6. Looks terrible. How to play this position with white pieces, folks? Yes, you take on b6 for 2 main functions. First of all, to make your rook a happier piece, given more scope. It can go here, here, or even here in this position. But also, right, the second biggest point, now there's a weakness on b6. That pawn is a new target for us. Not to mention those guys, long-term targets for our pieces. There's one more weakness to be attacked by the white pieces. So the game plays itself. Black almost in a zugzwang, by the way. Attacks the bishop, bishop g7. Well, attacks the pawn. Very simple chess. The rook, can you just please compare the happiness of this rook on b8 with the rook on d3 in the initial position. Can you see the effect of your pawn break in making your rook much happier piece? I'll become a good teacher, happy teacher, if you only consolidate this knowledge in itself, right? And here, of course, I mean, black has no moves whatsoever. Now the final phase, right? You reach maximum with your pieces. Amazing knight remains. Amazing rook on b7 has been created. And please look at the black pieces, right? That's the basic point of having weaknesses, because then your pieces are just getting tied down in guarding those weaknesses. Okay? If I ask you this way, find the winning plan for white in this position. Find a simplest winning plan from here for white. What would you say? The final piece, the worst piece principle. That's your worst place piece. You need to improve your king. But how? Where are the weaknesses in this position, folks? Well, you already told me that, right? One function of the pawn break a5 was to give them a weakness on b6. So how do you orient your king towards that weakness on b6? And you're a great player if you found the entire plan of king b5. Black has no counterplay whatsoever. Black needs to wait, sit down and wait for the king to arrive on b5, and the game is totally finished. Well, double threat, you will win the pawn, and the game is completely over. White is completely winning. Wasn't it cute that your initial a5 move paid way to what we just seen in this position? You need to see those connections. Otherwise, knowledge becomes isolated, right? Can you see the effect of the move a5? Can you break it down to its core and see how the later game sort of showed its effectiveness of this very simple plan a5 indeed? Okay, if they take on a5, as I mentioned, rook a3 attacks the pawn directly. One little counterplay option for black is this. What if they ditch the pawn and activate their rook and hit the pawn on b2? Should we defend that pawn? Yes, boys. We should defend the pawn. Why? Well, because you will have all the time in the world to capture the weakness on c5 and the weakness on a5. Meanwhile, you don't want to give any counterplay to the black pieces. Future belongs to you, so there is no hurry, there is no rush, there is no need for counterplay. So you play it slowly. You have all the time in the world to make all these moves. White is still completely winning. For example, I mean, they just need to wait. They have no moves left whatsoever. You will take on c5, guarding here. Also, there's a big threat right now. And if this, then you can go back to e4. You can take on a5, defend your knight, right? There are many ways for white to win this position. And as long as you find that little move b3, you're successful. And b takes a5, rook a3. They're coming there, guys, if they keep on waiting. The rook is a beautiful creature, attacking those new targets. Again, we can stop here. White is completely winning this position. Black has no counterplay whatsoever. Okay. The golden positions, the most instructive positions are going to my course on positional primer, but I will show you one of those as a sneak peek to that course, okay? Black to play. This position will consolidate everything we talked about in this episode. There's only one good move for black in this position. Please stop the video, think for yourself first, dig deeper, try to identify why that's a great plan for black. Well, since this video is about pawn breaks, maybe that's too much information and too revealing for the right solution, but I want you to really try to understand why that move is so effective for black here, and what would happen if you slip that move even for a single move. First of all, let's break it down, guys. Piece activity. The knight on f6 is not doing much. It's blunted by the pawn chain on f3 and e4. Has no forward moves whatsoever in this position. The same goes for the bishop on b7. Can you see it? We call these bishops as shooting on granites in chess. Hemmed in by white's pawn chain. g2, f3, e4 is clearly limiting the mobility of our bishop on b7, right? So in terms of these two pieces, they're not very happy to sit on this pawn formation. Weakness awareness. Are there any weak pawns in this position? Yes, the pawn on d6 is weak on a semi-open file. No black pawn can guard that pawn. That's an isolated pawn on d6. That's a future problem for black. So, can you combine A and B, please? What's the correct solution for black? You're a great player if you found the pawn break d5. The only move in the position for black that gives black an equal position. Okay? You forcefully get rid of the weakness on d6 while also activating both of your pieces. Multifunctional move to its core. Very importantly, white cannot play e5 because the knight will capture that pawn. Very crucial information for you. Thus, white either needs to take on d5, which is obviously helping your pieces in its position. Knight takes, hits the bishop, even helps this bishop's scope, right? And also after, let's say, bishop d2, there are other problems. Bishop c5, knight c5, all your pieces are coming to the center of the board, and suddenly it's black who is standing better in this position. So after d5, well, white needs to maybe play a move like knight g3 in this position, to be able to bolster that pawn on e4, but at the very least, you can take on e4. If white recaptures, then it's white who is having a weak pawn on e4, isolated king pawn in this case. Well, you can play knight c5, bishop c5, you have this outpost on e5 for the rest of the game. Black has several ways to play in this position, and after d takes e4, if they take back with the knight, you're not even forced to take on e4. You can first improve your knight to e5, attack the bishop, and this game is actually slightly in black's favor already, mostly because you solved your weakness problem and liberated your pieces even more. Maybe knight c3 comes to mind as well to attack d5 as well. And here, at the very least, we can take on e4. We can even simplify this position to its core because now the structure becomes symmetrical. There are no more weak pawns for black on d6. Black has no problems whatsoever, and they're totally okay in this position. So, can you now see the function of this pawn break d5 in letting black equalize the position and solve their strategic problem? Now I'll just show you one beautiful sequence. What if black slips, even for a single move, with this pawn break? What if black, let's say, plays a natural looking move, rook e8? How can white stop this beautiful pawn break d5? If you're playing with the white pieces, how would you play in this position? The move is bishop d4, guys. That's a prophylactic move. Why? Because now if you go d5, white will play the move e5, and now they're taking over the game completely. The knight is also running short of squares. Knight h5 will be answered by g4, and the knight is sort of trapped. But even without this tactic of, let's say, knight h5, g4, this will still be a preferable transformation for white. Why? Because now the bishop is hemmed in by its own pawn on d5, right? Can you see it? By playing e5, you basically created a very sad bishop on b7 in this position, and even your knight didn't improve much. In the main line, it goes to d5, right? Here, your knight is pushed around as well. So these two pieces are not happy to see this transformation, which means not every single pawn break is a good thing for you. You also need to look at the opponent's resources. Can they mess up with my plan? Can they keep things closed? Can they find a way to allow my pieces not to shine with happiness? These are the questions you must always ask yourself before engaging in a pawn break in chess. Pawn moves are very committal. There is no turning back, right? Pawns cannot go backwards. So it's always going to be committal decisions when you play with pawns, especially if they involve such central pawn structure transformations. It cannot be more committal than this. Obviously, you should seize the moment, right? Timely pawn break. Timely pawn break looks like this. That was the key moment for black, the critical moment to play d5 and solve all their problems and equalize naturally. If you slip, even for a single move, let's say rook c8, looks natural, bishop d4 anyhow. And white now stops you from playing the move d5, right? Because even here, your knight doesn't get trapped, but look what that happened to your position. The bishop is a terrible piece. You still have this isolated pawn on d5. That's a long-term target for the white pieces. The bishop is babysitting your pawn, right? So terrible. Now white has so many ways, even f4, let's say, yeah, to bolster their pawn and to claim more space on the king side. They can even play f5, f6 later on. I mean, your king might be so safe on the king side. And this is a very cramped and bad position for black. Please compare this position with the main line, right? These are great comparisons to see the cost of you not engaging in a correct pawn break, right? That would be a terrible shame for black, regret for black to end up in a very cramped position like that. Meanwhile, this pawn break was an option for us. That's why these positions are gold to my mind. Multifunctional positions. What did we learn from this example? Again, two things combined. Feeling for the pieces, namely, can you even identify when a piece is bad in terms of running short of squares, lacking scope, lacking mobility, and can you even see the pawn on d6 is a weakness, right? Can you even identify the weaknesses in a position? So mobility and, let's say, purpose or weakness targets, right? Mobility and weaknesses, these are great signals for us to play with correct pawn moves and engage in correct pawn breaks in chess. Breaks can obviously also be used when it comes to attacking the opponent's king. There should be a separate video on this. I even made a video about pawn storms in chess. I will post a link here as well, so please go and check. In the pawn storms video, I was showing you explosive pawn breaks to open up lines and to create an attack against the opponent's king. And maybe I can leave you with a little homework position that also touches that slightly. This position, black to play, Slav defense. I'm working on a course that is based on Slav pawn structures, and this was a model game in that course. Okay, well, can you look at the king on g2? We have some pieces that are potentially eyeing the king side. We have attacking chances on the king side. So the first move by black is very logical. They play the move, you guessed it right, g4. This is not the homework. This is logical. g4 is very logical because if white takes, then, well, your rook is becoming a very happy piece and you're entering in with rook h2 check, right? This part makes perfect sense. But after g4, what if white plays the more natural move h4? They want to keep it closed. This is your homework position, folks. How would you play this position with the black pieces? There's a clearly winning sequence for black. Let's say 3-ply calculation. Please engage in that with a clear conclusion and write to me on YouTube, okay? Your idea, little short sequence with a clear evaluation in the end. Giving feedback to each and every one of you on YouTube, please use the chance and leave a comment, please. And if you like this video, please consider liking and subscribing to my channel. It really keeps things going from my end, folks. Thank you so much for your support. Your subscriptions mean that I can produce similar videos to help you seriously improve your game. I get great satisfaction by helping people learn these concepts, by doing my best in breaking down the concepts to their core so you can transfer knowledge to different positions that show deeper similarities, right? That's the underlying function of my videos. I'm not only showing you positions that apply to a single case, but, right, those universal lessons, weakness awareness and feeling for the pieces, for example, that can be applicable to vastly different positions, right? That's the goal of learning, transfer after all. I hope you loved it. And if you want to follow my videos on the YouTube rabbit hole, please check this one next.